He said it's an unconventional pick and like it might be a controversial pick. But at the end of the day, the Blazers, from people I've talked to since then, have been doing their work on this kid for 2 years. One of their international scouts first noticed him at the FIBA Under-19 World Championships in Hungary 2 years ago and brought him to everybody else's attention. And then a couple members of the front office actually went out to China and spent a week out there watching him in person. And they've kind of been on him for a couple of years as, somebody that they had on their radar. And at the end of the day, they trusted their scouting, they trusted their process, they trusted their evaluations, and even though it was not a conventional pick, they felt like that was the pick for them to make, and I guess time is going to tell whether they're right or wrong. Like, they either are going to look like geniuses, or they're all going to get fired in 2 years. I don't know.
You just tell us kind of the shocking move that the Portland Trailblazers made in the draft.
Yeah, so they came into the night with the 11th overall pick. And when they were on the clock, they ended up trading back with Memphis. Memphis wanted to move up and select Cedric Coward. And so the Blazers moved back. They traded the 11th pick for the 16th pick. Got, a 2028 first-round pick from Orlando and a couple of future second-round picks, which, that's a pretty standard thing. If they felt like their guy is still going to be there, then you move back, you pick up a couple of assets, and then you still get your guy. It's exactly what the Blazers did, but who their guy ended up being was something that I don't think anybody in the world saw coming. I mean, I think, once they traded back, the guys that they've kind of been linked to throughout this whole process were, like a guy like Carter Bryant, who went 14th to San Antonio, and Agor Demon, who actually went a little bit higher than them. Like, these are all guys that they've kind of had been linked to in the process. The one that I think everybody assumed that was still on the board when they were up at 16 was Kasparis Yakachionis, who they had worked out, they had brought in for a workout, was widely kind of projected to go there in some of these mock drafts. And so when they called Yang Hansen's name, the Chinese center who was widely projected as probably mostly a second rounder, a few different mock drafts had him as like a late first, but I don't think anybody in the entire league, certainly nobody here locally, was expecting that was going to be the name that got called at the 16th overall pick. I'll just say that.
So what is the story behind this guy? It's very polarizing online. Some people are very much against this pick. Others see some potential. So what's really the upside in this? And is there potential harm if this does not go well?
Well, I mean, this was purely an upside play for them. And I mean, from a fit standpoint, it's a little bit puzzling because the Blazers just drafted Donovan Clingan 7th overall last year. So so now you're drafting another center who is also a 20-year-old project who's not nearly as NBA ready as Clingan was in his rookie season, less than a week after you make a trade for Jrue Holiday, which kind of signifies that you're trying to win now and you're trying to push into, if not the playoffs, at least the play-in and being competitive and not being one of the teams that's trying to tank for a lottery pick anymore, which the Blazers have been signaling since they went 23-18 in the second half of last season and then signed both general manager Joe Cronin and head coach Chauncey Billups to contract extensions at the end of the season. I think everybody kind of knew that they were trying to, take the next step and become more competitive, and that's what the Jrue Holiday trade signified. And then they do pretty much the opposite, and not only do they take a guy seems like he's kind of a project, and I don't know how much he's going to be able to play or ready to play this year, but also somebody that, just based on like the mock draft projections and just kind of where, the public wisdom, I guess, was on where people thought he was going to go. Joe Cronin admitted it last night that most people are going to think that this is a reach or that they maybe quote unquote overdrafted a guy. And, he said it's an unconventional pick and like it might be a controversial pick. But at the end of the day, the Blazers, from people I've talked to since then, have been doing their work on this kid for 2 years. One of their international scouts first noticed him at the FIBA Under-19 World Championships in Hungary 2 years ago and brought him to everybody else's attention. And then a couple members of the front office actually went out to China and spent a week out there watching him in person. And they've kind of been on him for a couple of years as, somebody that they had on their radar. And at the end of the day, they trusted their scouting, they trusted their process, they trusted their evaluations. And even though it was not a conventional pick, they felt like that was the pick for them to make. And I guess time is going to tell whether they're right or wrong. Like, they either are going to look like geniuses or they're all going to get fired in 2 years. I don't know.
Yeah, I personally love the pick.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a Yao Ming super fan, so anytime you could put a 7-1, 7-1 plus Chinese guy out there, I'm like, okay, what can he do? And, his combine footage looked really good. He had some sharp passes that played pretty well there. To me, it's interesting because I've always looked at that area of the draft, kind of that late lottery going into the early 20s, as kind of a crapshoot. You never know. Most of the guys you draft in that area are probably out of the league in 5 years anyway. So why not just take a swing for the fences and see what you can do with it? I mean, chances are that pick was worth a lot more before you made it. So I don't know. What's your thought on that? I mean, is there somebody that you think, when you're looking at like people picked after them, that you think would have been a better fit for the moment right now? Or is this a worthy kind of endeavor to kind of just swing for the fences a little bit?
It's kind of, I think this is the spot that they were in, at least in my opinion. You kind of are in a spot where you can afford to just take the best player available and not really worry about fit. Because if you look at what the Blazers already have, and, even taking out, the some of the veterans that are still there that are not going to be there long term, like the Jeremy Grants and the DeAndre Aytons and some of those guys. If you look at the young, like I guess what they would call the core of like guys that they're building around long term, and that's Scoot Henderson, Shaedon Sharpe, Denny Avdia, Tumani Kamara, and Donovan Clingan. That's a guy at every position. It's not like last year, like Clingan was a pretty obvious pick for them because they were one of the worst rim protecting teams in the league. And so you can draft one of the best rim protectors in the history of college basketball at the 7th pick. Like, that's a pretty straightforward pick to make. So last year it was like they felt like he was the best player on the board and he filled a need. This year, it's not like they went into the draft saying, we have to get this specific skill set, or we have to target this position, or this is the position that we don't have anybody at that we feel like is potentially a long-term guy. So at that point, you can kind of just take whoever you think is the best player and the highest upside swing and don't not feel like it's going to make or break your entire franchise if you miss on it. So from that standpoint, I totally get it. And I mean, I definitely can, see the merit in the philosophy of, if you think that someone is your guy, just take him and don't worry about what the consensus is or what the mock drafts say, or that you're going to get killed in like the post draft, grades and analysis and all that stuff, because like, at the end of the day, you're the ones that are going to have to live with the pick. And, if you there's a chance you could, make this pick, he doesn't pan out, and then somebody that gets drafted ahead of them turns into a star, and probably everybody's getting fired if that happens. On the other hand, you could be, this guy could be, there was a kind of a viral tweet going around last night of my friend Jake Fisher, who's a reporter for the Steinline, who tweeted that a Nuggets scout texted him that Yang Hansen is Chinese Jokic. And I mean, obviously you can't even the Blazers, like, I think if you're expecting any guy to be, Nikola Jokic, who like might be one of the 10 best players of all time at this point, like, you can't really expect that. But let's say they felt like, this is our guy, we like him. But then they kind of got cold feet at the last minute and said, you know what, let's just take kind of a more chalk pick. Let's take something that's a little bit more in line with the consensus. And then somebody else takes him and he does turn into Chinese Jokic. Then you might be like, oh, we should have just listened to our instincts. So I think that's just kind of what they did there. And, people can land wherever they want to land on it. I'm not going to sit here and act like I've watched a ton of Chinese basketball, so I don't really have, my own evaluations. I've only seen some highlights, but I know they did a ton of work on him, and I know that this front office, and particularly Mike Schmitz, one of their assistant general managers, was one of the most respected draft analysts in the media space for the 10 years he was working there before he took the job with the team. So I don't know. I mean, I think they've kind of earned a little bit of the benefit of the doubt if they really feel like this is the guy that they thought was the best pick there. But I mean, they're certainly going out on a limb.
Yeah, it was interesting to me too, that tidbit about the Denver scout. I mean, that's a good thing to hear. And then you got Rich Paul right there. So Rich Paul obviously seen something with this guy, because he was there to greet him as he was coming out of the stands.
It's a clutch guy. I mean, the Blazers, that's the other thing. The Blazers are a clutch organization. Like you look at on their roster, they have well, first of all, Chauncey Billups is a clutch client. And some of his staff, Tiago Splitter, who they just hired as assistant coach, is also a clutch guy. And then on the roster, Jeremy Grant is clutch. Scoot Henderson and Shaden Sharp both have signed with clutch in the last year. There's a couple of other guys that I'm forgetting off the top of my head who are clutch guys. So that's one of the organization, or that's the agency. Like, you hear about like the Knicks being a CAA organization. Like, I don't think it's quite to the level of like the Knicks and CAA, but the Blazers do a lot of business with clutch. So there is that element of it too. I don't want to like draw into any like conspiracy theories or any of that stuff, but I think, when it's an agency that you have a good relationship with and it's a guy that you like, I don't think that hurts.
The Blazers, as you know, were 36-46 last season, finishing 12th. Before we jump into the most recent trade with Anthony Simons and Jrue Holiday, you kind of take our listeners into just the temperature of the organization and the fan base of how this past season went. You mentioned the second half where the Trailblazers much more successful. Is there some optimism? Is kind of that really the residue of the Damian Lillard era, is that completely gone where there's truly focus on what's happening now heading into?
Yeah, there's a ton of optimism around the organization, and it really was a 180. Like I say, they went over for the last 41 games. That's not an arbitrary line that I'm drawing just because it's the half of the season. That that actually was the 42nd game of the season, so the first game of the second half of the year. That game was the actual turning point. That was a game that they had at home against Chicago. They had a couple of really bad losses earlier in that week to the Clippers and the Rockets, and the vibes were pretty bad. And like everybody knew Chauncey Billups was probably going to get fired at the end of the season, or not fired, but like not have his contract renewed. I guess if you want to get technical, everybody kind of knew that they were going to move on. And, Scoot Henderson was still struggling, and, nobody was really consistent, and the vibes weren't great. And then that game against Chicago, before the game, Chauncey Billups announces that he's pulling Shaden Sharp out of the starting lineup, and he tells us that he's doing it for defensive reasons because he doesn't think that Shaden has been kind of holding up that end of the floor. Shaden responds to that and by having a really good, defensive performance in that game. Eventually he, started doing that more consistently and got his starting spot back. The Blazers win that game, and that kicks off a 10-1 stretch that they had, right before the All-Star break. And now suddenly it's like, oh, this is interesting. Everybody thought they were just going to be in the mix for Cooper Flag, but now they went 10-1 over these, and they beat some good teams in that stretch too. They beat Indiana, they beat I forget who all they beat, but they definitely beat some good teams during that stretch. And then, after the All-Star break, they kind of start winning some more games. Like they had, they ended up, they had two more, 4 or 5 game winning streaks after that. And you also just started to see like real improvement from, Scoot Henderson and from, Shaden Sharp. Donovan Clingan started getting more comfortable and started being able to play more minutes. Denny Avdia made a huge leap last year. Toumani Camara, made all defense. The Blazers, this is how extreme that swing was. They had the third worst defense in the league for the first half of the season. They had the third best defense in the league for the second half of the season. So that's just kind of and then at the end of the season they decide, instead of just doing what everybody thought they were going to do and letting Chauncey Billups go, they signed him to an extension, and Joe Cronin got an extension too, and now I don't know, here we are.
Well, and then now you've got Jrue Holiday, who is probably one of the most cerebral, defensive-minded guards, 2-time champion. I mean, if there's anybody for Scoot to really mentor under, Jrue's a good guy for that. And I wonder, I think it's a league of imitation, and you see a team like the Rockets bringing in a savvy veteran, Fred VanVleet, to kind of mentor the team there. Is that kind of what they're thinking with Jrue?
So I think that's a good comparison. The one that I've been thinking about, though, since they did this, was when the Thunder traded, that when the Thunder first blew it up and they traded for, they traded Paul George, they traded Russell Westbrook, they got SGA in that Paul George trade, and they traded for Chris Paul, and everybody kind of thought when they traded for Chris Paul that summer, oh, they're going to blow it up, like they're trying to rebuild, so I'm sure they're just going to reroute him to a contender and get more assets. But they actually kept Chris Paul for that 1 year. And that was the year that, the season got shut down halfway through when COVID first hit, and then it was in the bubble. That team wasn't a contender, but they were a playoff team. Having Chris Paul there was really good for SGA's development, and obviously now you've seen, what he's turned into now. And I think that's the kind of thing that they sort of envision Jrue having that effect on Scoot Henderson. But I also, I think it's really easy just, whenever a team that's kind of young and hasn't really won anything brings in any kind of a veteran player like that, it's very easy to just kind of say, oh yeah, he's going to just, come in and be a mentor and be like a player coach. But like Jrue Holiday is still like, he's not as good as he was a couple of years ago when the Celtics won the championship. He had kind of a down year this year. He's probably on the downswing of his career, but he's still pretty good. Like he's still a productive player and is probably going to be a productive player for another couple of years at least. So it's kind of going to be that, that sweet spot of, it is going to be great for Scoot to have him around and, have a guy like that to be able to kind of lean on. But Jrue can still play too, and he's still going to, be a significant contributor. So it's not like they're just bringing him in just to like be a babysitter for the point guard that they took 3rd overall 2 years ago.
Can you talk about just the revamped coaching staff as well with Tiago Splitter, Patrick St. Andrews, Quentin Crawford, all around Chauncey Billups? It just seems like they're retooling just kind of this mindset of this team heading into next season. Does that really rise expectations of what this team is capable of, do you think?
Well, it certainly shows that now that Chauncey Billups and Joe Cronin have new contract extensions, they're getting everything a lot more in line, and they're, being, I would say this is the most serious coaching staff that they've had. And this is the second big, shakeup of the staff that they've done in the last two off seasons. Last summer, they won 21 games in the first year post Damian Lillard. They didn't want to fire Chauncey because they were going to go into that year trying to tank, and so there was no point in paying 2 coaches when you're trying to be bad anyway. So they weren't going to fire him, and so instead of firing him, they changed up some things on their coaching staff. They let go of Scott Brooks, who was his lead assistant. They let go of his brother Rodney, who was on the staff. And then Steve Hetzel, another one of their assistants who was pretty well regarded, left to take a job on Brooklyn's staff. And so they brought in Nate Bjorkgren, who was once the head coach of the Pacers, which was kind of a disaster, but he's a well-regarded tactician. He worked for Toronto, he's worked for Phoenix, he's worked for other teams. And then Chris Fleming, who was in Chicago and actually was pretty instrumental in Kobe White's development with the Bulls. And that's kind of part of why they brought him in to work with Scoot. And so they did that. And then this past, this summer, they, some of the contracts were up again. The whole staff was just on 1-year deals because everybody knew that Chauncey was going into the last year and they were probably going to just let everybody go at the end of the season. So they kept they kept Nate Bjorkgren, they kept Ronnie Burrell, they kept a couple of kind of the end of bench assistants or behind the bench assistants. Jonah Herskew, who has been an assistant, one of the behind the bench assistants, got promoted to be the head coach of the Rip City Remix, which is their G League team, which is a great opportunity for him. Now he's going to get some real reps as a head coach, and that's going to put him on the radar with other teams to try to take the next step in his career. So that was kind of the idea there. And then they made 3 pretty, high-profile new hires. They brought in Tiago Splitter, who you mentioned, who, he's worked in the NBA for a number of years. He was a player development guy for the Nets under Steve Nash. And then he was a assistant under Ime Udoka for a year with the Rockets and worked a lot with Alperen Şengün, and Şengün has credited him publicly with helping him turn into an all-star. And then last year he went to France to become the head coach of Paris basketball, which is the same club that Tuomasi Salo, who's now the head coach of the Grizzlies, was the head coach of before the Grizzlies hired him for their staff. And so Splitter goes there, takes over for Isalo, and Paris basketball goes 23-7. They win the French Cup championship, and they qualify for EuroLeague for the first time in franchise history and make the EuroLeague playoffs. So, he has a pretty successful run there. The Blazers bring him over. And then they hire Patrick St. Andrews, who was Taylor Jenkins' lead assistant for a long time in Memphis and was let go when Taylor Jenkins was let go near the end of this season. But, he's a well-regarded guy. He worked under Mike Budenholzer, both in Atlanta and in Milwaukee. And, people seem to really like him and think he has a strong future as a head coach. And then the other guy that they hired is Quentin Crawford, who has been an assistant with the Suns and with the Lakers under Frank Vogel. And then last year he was the head coach of the Stockton Kings, and they won the G League championship. So that's just kind of what the revamped coaching staff looks like right now. And, Nate Bjorkgren and Ronnie Burrell stuck around. So it's a little bit of carryover, but it's definitely new. And I would say upgraded. But, none of us really know like what each assistant coach does. That's only stuff you can kind of guess on and speculate on. But it's a pretty, I would say it's a pretty well, upgraded staff.
I always see when a team starts spending on coaches as a good sign. And is that, I know, it's the Paul Allen estate. And I think Jody Allen's the chairwoman who's running,
Yeah.
the owner. Are you seeing that kind of shift that Portland is kind of willing to spend some money on, practice facilities, coaches, stuff like that to turn into a destination? Or, because for a small market team, I hate that, but small market team,
It's true.
it can be hard to kind of compete with the biggies in the West Coast and the East Coast.
Yeah. So that's a little bit of an interesting thing, and it's kind of a reversal because the Blazers over the years have not been a team that has a reputation for spending big on coaches. And it's especially interesting that they're making these big investments now because, you brought up the Paul Allen estate. The team is for sale. They just announced a month ago that they've officially put the team up for sale and they've started the auction or the bidding process. So usually when a team is about to get sold, they're going to cut costs and they're going to, try to not spend money on this kind of stuff and just kind of strip it down so that whoever comes in and buys it doesn't feel like they're taking a loss. So both them spending money on coaching staff and, the trade that they just made, bringing in Jrue Holiday, who they traded Anthony Simons, who was on an expiring contract. So that was going to be $27 million coming off their books. Now they're taking on $104 million over the next 3 years for Jrue Holiday. So that's a pretty significant added payroll that they're bringing on while the team is for sale. And so when they announced the team was for sale, I was actually in Chicago for the pre-draft combine, and I spent that week talking to folks from the front office and just kind of gauging their feel for, how the sale news has been taken and, if they'd heard anything. And what everybody told me was that the message from ownership was, this is going to be business as usual. Keep doing what you're doing. Everything's status quo. Don't worry about restrictions on, you can't spend on this. You can't, we can't spend this on staff. We can't spend this on salaries. Everything is just going to be status quo. Just, keep running the team not like the team isn't going to be sold. And usually when you hear that, you just think in my mind, I was like, yeah, of course they're telling me that that's what they got told. That's because what do you want them to say? Are they going to say, oh yeah, no, ownership told us we have to freeze salaries. We can't make any hires. We're just going to be completely in a holding pattern. So I didn't really take it that seriously, but they spent big on Jrue Holiday, bringing him in, taking on additional salary, and they spent significant money to upgrade their coaching staff. So, you have to kind of give credit where it's due there.
For the common fan, what does a change of ownership truly mean? Does that just depend on just how the sale is going to go? Because I think a lot of times, especially nowadays, sports ownership is pretty hot. We've seen so many transactions and different sports. And I think for Comets fans, I'm just wondering if they're really understanding what this means for them in terms of them going to games, them just cheering on their team. So with the fan base in Portland, when the sale does occur, I know it's hard to predict, but I guess my question is, should the fan base be truly paying attention to this in terms of how they are cheering on the Trailblazers, like the relationship with the team?
That depends entirely on who buys it, because it's funny because they, for years, ever since Paul Allen died in 2018, everybody has known that the team was going to have to get sold eventually because the terms of Paul Allen's will were that eventually all of his assets were going to have to be sold and have the money go to charity. And that's been something that's been rolled out gradually over the last 7 years. Like, they've sold a couple of his super yachts. They sold his art collection. They've sold some of his real estate stuff. And they're just getting around to the Blazers now. But ever since he died, there's kind of been this perception among the fan base, some of it unfair in my opinion, that Jody Allen is just totally disengaged and she's an absentee owner and, they need to sell the team and the team is never going to get back to any level of success until the team gets sold. And now that the team is officially for sale, people are worried that and I don't think this worry is really something that's, a serious possibility, but people are worried that the team is going to move, which I don't think is really because we all know that they're going to greenlight expansion sometime in the next couple of years, and Seattle and Las Vegas are going to get teams. And the fear in Portland has always been that since Paul Allen was a Seattle guy, and that was where he and Bill Gates founded Microsoft, and he also owns the Seahawks, that eventually the team was just going to move to Seattle after the Sonics left. So that's kind of just been something that fans have been worried about forever. And now it's like, let's say somebody comes in and buys the team and looks at the arena, which is 30 years old at this point, and decides they want a new arena and the city doesn't want to pay for it. And that's been the thing that I think people who like stoking fears about this kind of stuff have been talking about. I don't think that's really a serious possibility at all. My understanding is that the Blazers, the current ownership's wishes are for the team to remain in Portland. The league office certainly doesn't want the team to move because it's one of the most successful small markets in the league. They've been in the playoffs 26 out of 37 times in the 37 years since Paul Allen bought the team in 1988. They've been since 2000. They've been in the top 10 in attendance in the league 17 times out of 25 years. So it's not a market that I think the NBA wants to go away from. So that part of it, I'm not as worried about as other people. But then, you think about like who could come in and buy the team. And, a couple of years ago, Phil Knight made publicly an offer. That offer was turned down. Obviously, that offer, which was $2 billion, is now, you just saw the Lakers go for 10. You saw the Celtics go for 7. $2 billion is not even close to going to get you even the cheapest NBA team on the market. I would be shocked if the Blazers don't go for at least 4 or 5 now, given the current, the trend of these franchise value. But everybody just kind of thinks that when a new owner comes in, it's going to be like Steve Ballmer, where it's like this perfect, balance of he's willing to write a check for anything, but he also kind of gets out of the way and doesn't really, meddle too much in basketball decisions. And now the Clippers, after being a joke for decades under Donald Sterling, now they're really a world-class organization, and he's really done a lot to, not just, with the roster, but spending on a new arena, spending on practice facilities, spending on staff and infrastructure and all that kind of stuff. That's the best case scenario. But you could also have a situation where somebody, everybody wanted Robert Sarver to go, and obviously, Robert Sarver is one of the worst owners in NBA history too. But Matt Ishbia buys the Suns, and everybody says he's the savior because, immediately after he buys the team, he greenlights this Kevin Durant trade, and he's spending all this money on all this different, like this new practice facility, all this stuff. But then he kind of, you see kind of where the Suns are at right now. He thought he could just come in and throw money around and he could just buy his way back into relevance, and it just hasn't happened. And now the Suns are totally hamstrung because he just can't get out of his own way, and he has to kind of he feels like he has to make a splash all the time. And now the Suns have one of the worst futures in the league. So it entirely depends on who buys the team. So it's tough to say too much whether a sale is going to be a good thing or a bad thing. It had to happen eventually because those were the terms of Paul Allen's will, that it had to be sold eventually. But until we know who buys the team, it's hard for me to really say one way or the other whether it's going to be a good thing or a bad thing compared to the current situation.
This might be a little bit far-fetched, but with the WNBA expanding into Portland, is this related at all? Because we've seen a lot more synergy with NBA teams and WNBA teams, with Portland gaining a WNBA franchise. Does that push things in the direction of keeping, the NBA in Portland for people that are, stoking fears, or they're scared that the NBA might be leaving Portland? With the WNBA moving into Portland, the recent announcement of the high season ticket deposits being made, is that a factor in this at all, you think?
I don't think it affects whether the team is going to stay in Portland. And just to be clear, I don't think it's a serious possibility that the team leaves. That's just something that's kind of out there in the ether. With that said, the Bethal family, who bought who are going to be the owners of the WNBA team and are also the owners of the Portland Thorns, the NWSL team, they are minority investors in the Sacramento Kings. They're Raj Bethal, the father, is Vivek Ranadive's alternate governor. So they have a pretty significant stake in the Kings. And the idea has come up locally. Another reporter here actually reached out to them for a statement and was not told no. But the idea has kind of come up of, maybe there's a possibility that they sell their stake in the Kings and put an ownership group together to try to buy the Blazers and just consolidate all of their ownership, their sports team ownership stuff in Portland. I don't know that that's, in the works, but another reporter asked them for a comment about that, and their response was something to the effect of like, we're always evaluating different, possibilities for investing in the sports space, something like that. They didn't say, no, we're not interested. I don't think they have enough money on their own to just buy the team outright, but they certainly could put a group together. So that's one way that I think the WNBA team coming in could affect the Blazers sale and the Blazers future. But I don't know. It's too early at this point. I've gotten the impression that the team said in the press release when they announced that the Blazers were going to be for sale, they said that it was going to drag into next season. And so I've been expecting it's going to take like 9 to 12 months for them to find a buyer. So I don't think that's going to get resolved anytime soon. But the Bethal element of it is definitely something that I'm keeping an eye on, and that when they were asked about it, they did not rule out the possibility and say, no, we're not even thinking about it. So, we'll see who ends up buying the team and what the bid ends up looking like, what the ownership group ends up looking like, what their plans for it are. But that's definitely something worth keeping an eye on for sure.
A couple more questions.
Of course.
Seeing how the Valkyries have been very successful, I just want to get your opinion on the playbook for Portland. Have they been following that, or are they just kind of going in their own direction just to make sure that this team is ready for just the fan base that's with Portland? Or are they really paying attention to what's happening with the Valkyries? What's kind of the temperature in terms of what's happening with the rest of the W2? What's going to happen with the expansion, you think?
It's kind of too early to say. I've been watching very closely how the Valkyries rollout has been, and I've been really very impressed with pretty much every aspect of the way they've rolled it out. I love the Valkyries name, and I love the logo and the colors and all that stuff. Like, I think they did a great job on the branding. But then even just on the basketball side, what I like about what the Valkyries did, and obviously this is the Warriors ownership group, and they have all the money in the world to throw at this stuff. So there's that. But they didn't say we have to make a big splash and hire a big name and hire somebody that everybody's heard of. They hired Ohema Nianen, who was an assistant GM with the New York Liberty, which is one of the class organizations in the league, but that's not a name that most people know. But she was very well regarded behind the scenes, and they said, we're just going to hire you, and we're going to just kind of let you build the roster and make coaching hire. And then the coach they hired, Natalie Nakase, who was an assistant with the Las Vegas Aces, who had also been an assistant with the Clippers under Ty Lue in the past, so she has some NBA experience as well. She's, that clearly seemed like the right coaching hire. They didn't go out and say, we have to get a big name, we have to make a splash, we have to win the press conference. So it seems like they're really committed to building the team the right way, not just from a sense of like, we want to, win the press conference, we want to, make a splash, we want to, have some good PR. They seem like they're really committed to doing it in a sustainable way. It's too early to really say whether the Bethals are going to be following that playbook, or if they're going to be taking a different approach, because they still don't have, they basically don't have an organization yet. They're working on, searching for a general manager right now. I think interviews are still ongoing there, so I have no idea who they're going to hire or what route they're going to go for that. Are they going to take a similar approach? They're going to hire kind of a lower level front office staffer from a WNBA team who they think is ready for a bigger opportunity? Are they going to try to go for a big name who's like an ambassador for the franchise, but maybe isn't as focused on like the actual day-to-day job of running a team, and how's that going to go? We kind of know what the name is going to be. They haven't announced this yet, but they league registered trademarks for a bunch of stuff related to the Portland fire a week or two ago. And I've also been hearing from sources for several months that was probably the way that they were going to go. So I'm curious how that ends up looking once, they roll that out, what they do with the logo, what the reaction is once they do all that stuff. Like you mentioned earlier, the season ticket sales have been very good. They just announced today that they've crossed over 10,000 season ticket deposits, which is pretty impressive for a team that doesn't exist yet. But we still, they still don't have a officially announced name and logo. They still don't have a general manager. They still don't have a coach. They're going to have to do the expansion draft. They're going to have to then deal with the regular draft. So there's so much left to go before we see what it actually ends up looking like. And Toronto, who's also starting the same year as them, the Toronto Tempo, they have a lot more of that stuff in place. They have a general manager in Monica Wright-Rogers. They haven't hired a coach yet, but they're working on that. And they're a little bit ahead of Portland. I am very impressed with what the Valkyries have done so far, and I think it would be a good idea for the Bethals to copy them as closely as possible, but it's a little early to say what they're actually going to do.
Final question for you. A lot of different cities, including the city I live in, Denver, really anxious, trying to get a WNBA franchise, but Portland won out, along with what you mentioned with Toronto as well, Golden State. Within the basketball community within Portland, what set them apart in gaining this franchise? Was it the connection with the Trailblazers factor into this? Was it the fact that Portland did have a WNBA team in the past? Or do you think there's been an uprising since, they left of gaining a WNBA franchise back in Portland? What's the temperature of the fan base? Are we seeing what we mentioned before, the season ticket deposits? But just when you talk to basketball fans, when they're going through a Trailblazers game over the past years, kind of what is your feelings of having a WNBA team back in their city? Has this always been kind of a yearning, kind of a sense of trying to get this team back there? And then what has it been since the announcement and kind of all the things that are possible for the future of this team?
Well, I think, first of all, the WNBA is in a very different place as a league than it was 25 years ago when they first launched the original version of the Portland Fire. The Fire actually were one of the more well-attended teams in the league at the time. I think they had around 8,000 fans a game, which was a lot for the WNBA at the time. But they ended up folding because, Paul Allen was, once ownership, it's a kind of a complicated thing, but like the ownership reverted back from the league to the NBA teams in the sister cities, and Paul Allen just decided to fold the team. So it just didn't end up working out there for financial reasons. But Portland is a city that for the longest time only really has one major professional sports team, and that's the Trailblazers. So there's a deep, basketball connection there. And then also just generally speaking, in Portland is the state of Oregon really is just a huge hotbed for women's sports in general. I mentioned the Thorns earlier that the Bethals also own. They lead the NWSL in attendance pretty much every year, and the Oregon and Oregon State women's basketball teams at the college level are also very popular. Obviously, Sabrina Ionescu played at Oregon, Satu Sabali, there's a bunch of, Oregon has a really well-regarded women's basketball program that has produced a lot of stars in the WNBA, and so that has a big fan base here too. And I just think it's a good market. It's a good match for, the fan base and the city. And, you're seeing from what the ticket sales have been, where now they have over 10,000 season ticket deposits, and the team is not going to play their first game for another 11 months. So, clearly it was the right decision for the league to go back there. It just, I think people have wanted it for a while. It's just, the timing wasn't right for expansion. There was an attempt to do it a year ago or a year before they announced it, and that kind of fell through for a bunch of weird reasons. And then, the Bethals came in and ended up deciding to do it, and it ended up working out, and people here are real excited for it. And I'm really curious to see how it ends up playing out.
Sean, appreciate the time. Thank you very much. Can you let our audience know where they can find you on social media, where they can find your coverage, and do you have any other upcoming projects for the rest of the year as well?
Yeah, so just go to rosegardenreport.com. It's a kind of Substack newsletter type of thing with free and paid subscriptions available. Most of the more substantive stuff is paywalled, but I like to think I give people a worthwhile, a good product for the money that I think people, if you're interested in the Trailblazers or, the upcoming WNBA expansion process that's still ongoing, I feel like I give people the kind of coverage for that for both of those things that you're not really getting anywhere else. So I would just say go sign up, go subscribe, and follow me I'm not really on Twitter much these days beyond just posting links and stuff, but I'm on there. I'm on Blue Sky, Instagram. All of my socials are just my last name @Highkin. So just follow me on there.
Thank you, Sean. Appreciate the time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good to talk to you, Justin.